traveling and coming back by then. How many tigers are there?
So, good morning, and welcome to this session. I think everybody is concerned about what's happening to our planet, and that's something that we will discuss here, this panel of extremely eminent people. To my extreme right is Ajay Mathur, who headed our negotiations at the recently concluded Paris talks, which ended in the Paris Agreement. Ajay is an old energy expert and will be now heading the Energy Research Institute in Delhi. On my right is Mr. Jairam Ramesh, who was our Environment Minister amongst many other important positions that he has held. He's a different kind of politician. He does other stuff apart from politics. He does politics, but he does other interesting stuff too, and he's had an interest in the environment. On my left is Valmik Thapa. Those of you who are interested in wildlife would know who he is. He has dedicated his life to animals and to the tiger and to conservation and to sanctuaries. And on my left is Alex Shumatov, who has done a lot of very good work, investigative journalism, if you will, investigative research, if you will, on different ecosystems, different kinds of animals, different kinds of species, their destruction, their conservation, etc. So we really have an excellent panel, and I'd like to start by giving them a big hand. So I think we will start with Ajay, because Ajay has just come back from Paris, and I would like to ask him that as we discuss this, red signals, green hopes, what does that mean? The kinds of barriers that we are facing and the kinds of hopes that we all have that these barriers to environmental integrity would disappear, that they should just go away. We all hope that. It's not happening. But we would like to hear from Ajay what he experienced in Paris. Where have we gone from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement? Where are we? How big are these red signals internationally? So Ajay, would you like to tell us in about a couple of minutes the big broad strokes of what happened?
Well, Paris, in my view, was a game changer. It was a game changer because not just people, but governments recognized that change is needed, that everybody on the world has to act differently. This, I think, has been a major change. Many people went to Paris believing that we could continue with business as usual. Clearly, that's not the case after Paris. Second, there is a broad agreement that every country needs to do action, but what I and India will do will be different from, example, what somebody else in some other country will do, and therefore this has to be based on what makes sense for you as a person, as a country. Third, that as we go ahead, there must be a system which tells us what have we done, what have we accomplished, and do we need to speed up our various actions. These are the three big things that came out of Paris. Now, if you ask me, is it enough? No, it's not. But what is intrinsic in this agreement is this nature of the fact that we constantly look at what we have done and the possibility of tightening it as time goes by. This, hopefully, together with public participation, and one of the central things here is the need for transparency in reporting what countries have done. This transparency, I hope, and with the participation of you and I, would convert this into something where we will hold our governments and the world accountable for where we have gone, and more importantly, for where we have not gone. To sum it up, all of us matter. All of us will do things together. All of us will do things in a manner that can be seen, reported, and acted on by each one of us.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a very quick question. Did you think that Paris was a positive imbalance, or do you think that that Paris was imbalance?
Well, For somebody like me, it was positive.
I want to hear from the audience. Who thinks that Paris was positive? Who thinks that Paris was zero? And who thinks Paris was positive?
Positive, I heard.
Same to same. Who thinks it was a disaster? There's one person there who says that Paris was bad. So we have a very different kind of perception here about what Paris was. Hearing it so-called from the horse's mouth, it's good to know that Ajay thinks that in the balance it was better than worse. But yes, we can take this up in the discussion and you can tell us, especially the gentleman there who thought it was a disaster, why he thinks it was a disaster. I would ask Jairam Ramesh, because he's been inside the national policy making process, and he should tell us. Jairam, I'd ask you to tell them briefly, what have successive Indian governments done? Not only the government that you were involved with, the government now, the governments past, how has India tried to handle the conflict between its huge red alarm signals and the desire to go green, to go forward, go sustainable? How have our governments handled that?
Well, we've gone through phases of this trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection. We had in the 70s and the early 80s a slew of progressive legislation. In the wake of crisis at that point of time, we had the Air Pollution Control Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Forest Conservation Act, the Environment Protection Act, and many other legislation. However, our enthusiasm to pass legislation has not been matched by an enthusiasm to enforce the legislation. So while we have on paper some of the best laws in the world, in terms of enforcement and compliance, I'm afraid it leaves a lot to be desired. And the reason for that is because there is, in the short run at least, a perceived conflict between the objective of generating jobs, the objective of getting new investment, the objective of pushing GDP growth, and the objective of protecting natural resources. Now, there is no conflict really, because if you want growth to be sustainable, you have to do it in a manner that is sustainable ecologically and that protects your natural resources. However, there is in the mindset of all governments, and there is really no exception to this, in the mindset of all governments, there is a trade-off, there is a conflict between these two, and I'm afraid in 99.99% of the cases, the choices when they are made, they are in favor of boosting economic growth and not necessarily on protecting the environment. So I think that's a reality that we have to contend with. And we have to understand really why is it that governments, irrespective of political ideologies, end up paying obeisance to the objective of environmental protection, but when it comes to actual action, end up paying obeisance to GDP growth.
I think here I will go back to what Ajay said. It has to be participatory. Governments want to get re-elected, they want the vote, so they want to show big flagship things. They don't want slow conservative things like environment. Ajay just said before Jairam did that we need participation. How many of you think that we can actually force governments, and why has it not happened so far? I'm sure Valmik will talk about that when we get around to him. But a very quick answer, how do you think we can do it better in forcing governments? Jairam said very candidly, governments will go with growth at the cost of the environment. Do we as civil society have it in us to do something more than we've done so far? Quick ones. If you'll have to give me a reason why, but let me go and how. But let me go back to Jairam very quickly. You know, China is held up to us as an example of how wonderful everything is. Their economy is about 10 times ours, and they have done it by destroying their environment. Is this something that the Indian government has to deal with? Does this come up in discussion? Look at China.
Well, I think the temptation to follow the grow now, pay later model is very, very strong. The US did it, Europe did it, Brazil did it, China did it. So why should India be different? So this grow now, pay later, that you have 20, 25 years of rapid economic growth and worry about the consequences of economic growth subsequently is ingrained in Indian decision making. And one has to understand why we need to be different. It's not enough to say that we should be different. Why do we need to be different? And I think that's really, and you talked about public participation and public involvement, putting pressure on systems of governance to take decisions differently. I think this will come when there is a widespread recognition of why India needs to be different from the way the Chinese have got high economic growth or the way the rest of the world did. And very briefly and telegraphically, I would say that there are 4 reasons why India must be a departure from the grow now, pay later. First is a demographic reason. I mean, we are today 1.25 billion and we're going to add 400 million people in the next 30 years. There's no country in the world with, most countries are seeing declining population, including China for that matter. And we are going to be the country that's going to add 1/3 of our current population in the next 3 decades. So sustainable development for us is not a luxury, it becomes a necessity. Second, as Ajay said, the climate change argument. We may not have caused global warming in the past, but we certainly have maximum vulnerability to global warming in terms of monsoon, glaciers, forest cover, mean sea levels. There's no country in the world which has these multiple dimensions of vulnerability. Third, and this I would say is the most important and urgent argument for the departure from grow now, pay later, is that environment is having a public health impact. Enormous public health impact. You're already beginning to see in terms of air pollution. Water pollution has always had an impact. It's been a silent killer as far as India is concerned. And chemical contamination also has been a very serious issue. So there's a public health argument. And finally, there is this argument about livelihoods. In most Western countries, when you talk of environment, you talk of lifestyles. In our country, even today, even with being the world's 3rd largest economy, the fastest growing economy, even today, environmental issues largely are livelihood issues and less of lifestyle issues. So I think India must make up its mind. When I say India must make up its mind, the dominant discourse has to be that we cannot afford the grow now, pay later model, and that we need to make choices which will give us 8% economic growth, but at the same time protect our forests, protect our rivers, protect our mountains, protect our air and our water. I think it's possible, and it's possible when systems of public participation, as Ajay also said, begin to put pressure on the governance systems to make things differently.
Absolutely. I think we'll keep coming back to participation, public pressure, what civil society can do, what you and I can do. So let's keep that strand with us. And if anyone has smart ideas, please write them out on a piece of paper and hand them to the festival organizers or to any one of us. Valmik, let me come to you. Valmik Thapar has been very closely involved, apart from wildlife and nature, also in looking at public policy and looking at the kinds of policies that are being made by the Indian governments and where they are failing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that to give a sense of...
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that because 40 years of my life have gone in this. And our biggest problem are the governments. And our biggest problem is that everyone will go to international platforms and national platforms and talk about how we are going to change course, what is the quality of life we are going to bring. But they forget one really important thing. The mechanism of governance to bring that change in every district of India is nearly non-existent. The level of ignorance in government servants, right from the patwari upwards, who take little important decisions from the village, for the town, for the city, nobody has dealt with. The red signals dot our map. Puffs of poison come out from our cities. And we still go on talking. I am tired of that. I remember when I worked with Jairam, and I'm going to give you this example because I don't want to get into an argument. He and I have been old friends. When I worked with him, one of the most interesting ideas that we worked on, which was an original idea of mine, Jairam came as Minister of Environment and Forest, was to create a different mechanism in the Ministry of Environment and Forest. We both agreed that there should be a department that protects our natural resource. for forest and wildlife. And the story is absolutely horrendous, but it shows you where we are. And my job today is to be frank and brutal. At a National Board of Wildlife meeting, when I presented this idea to our then Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Jairam was the Minister of Environment and Forest. After presenting the idea, he turned to Jairam and said, "Do it." Just these two words, "Do it." Make this department, clear the secretary's massive files that are dumped across the table and under the table. And I've been in this ministry for 25 years, running the corridors of this ministry. So there's very little I don't know about it. We came and celebrated, Jairam and me, that evening in my house. I then sat with Jairam and we worked out a really dream structure of a department. I took all the graphics to make printouts so his ministry had the detail, how we were going to develop and build a dream department, really make this ministry tick so it affects and impacts the states and the states could do something different. In typical Indian government style, and it goes on to this day, in every little sphere, 1 year rolled by. He and I worked very fast, and then everything went silent. The next National Board of Wildlife meeting came, and I asked Dr. Manmohan Singh, I said, "What on earth happened to your idea? You instructed Jairam Ramesh to make a separate department."
That would be my idea, not your idea.
The reply was very simple. He turned to a gentleman called Mr. T.K. Nair, who was his principal secretary, and said, "What happened? A year and a half has gone by." He said, "Sir, the committee of secretaries overruled your idea." And very silently, this was accepted. A prime minister's dictate to his Minister of Environment and Forest on what to do was overruled by a committee of secretaries. Now, I'm not going to go into the inter-service rivalries, but take that to the next stage. Go to the district collector,
Yes.
go to the forest officer, the environmental cell in the district. Let's start working at the level we should work. Let's go to each district. The Rajasthan government has recently created a competition as a beginning. How do you get a low carbon footprint in every district? So all the districts of Rajasthan, the collectors are competing. They're trying to understand in this district where are the most important puffs of poison. How are we going to change course to reduce that? I'm not saying it can end, but there has to be a process to minimize it, because the bureaucracies of this country, more than the politicians, and believe me, after 40 years I'm telling you this, are absolutely abominable. They prevent innovative thinking, they prevent public participation. You can't have genuine public-private partnerships. There are very few ministers like Jairam who had an open office and who welcomed new ideas. The bureaucracy will prevent that idea, and you really find it tough in India to go and find a path in this minefield. One, yap about the great things we are doing, and two, go to any district and ask the district collector or any government service, what does climate change mean? What does global warming mean? We haven't started our basic education. So I believe, I'm not going to say more now because I can go on and on this, that the 5 to 8 million government servants in this country require to be educated about what needs to be done. If you don't do that, nothing is going to happen.
From the resonance that I see to Valmiki's analysis of what is holding this country back, the vicious stranglehold of the bureaucracy, how many of you agree with that? And many of you don't?
The other half
How
say
many-
politicians are responsible.
I can see one who has got his dharma has got to say, make him say that, but how many of you think the bureaucracy is not responsible for what Valmiki has just explained? You think it's not responsible? Who is? Who is responsible? Somebody is. Sorry?
The mutual understanding and the mutual existence of the whole project is not there. Like the politician and the parties are working at their own level, and the individuals are not being educated for the cause. Like
You think that that's a mishmash? Can we have a mic going around so that people can say their piece? A quick one before we start with Alex. Somebody else, while that mic is coming on, somebody else wants to say something? A or many?
Hello.
Quick one.
It's the nexus between corporates and politicians.
Nexus between corporates and politicians.
That's what, the same thing, the difference between the corporates, politicians, individuals and every other
So
organization.
now we're saying something else. We're moving away from the public sector to the private. So for government and politicians.
The private sector must, because it's one of the most powerful sector and the
Sure.
leading sector in the country.
Anyone else who has a view, and then we will go back to our speakers. Quick one.
What I'm missing is civic society. I mean, I'm from Europe, so I'm reluctant to. I won't get
Go ahead.
involved into discussion on Indian bureaucracy, and it's maybe not as bad in Europe, but it's also a problem, the bureaucracy and the politics.
It doesn't have much to say in
But
Europe. That's the
the
problem.
hope is that there is millions, if you add it up, and people have done this, about 200 million people in the world who are leading all kinds of civic society organizations, from environment to social justice and everything in between. And I think the connection both from politics and bureaucracy and organizations have to be with this third domain.
Yeah, sure.
Just to answer your point, there are a lot of people who are engaged with the third domain. It's been a part of our lives. It's quite a difficult one. At the moment, that third domain is being strangulated. It's not easy for a non-governmental organization or an outspoken non-governmental individual to find a path right now. Is not easy. They've suffered tremendously. We have all kinds of strange ways to make them suffer. I won't give you examples of that right now because our speaker to the left hasn't had a chance. So just to tell you that that's something which is a part of our lives.
Comes back to public participation. We'll come back to that before the session closes. Alex, last but not least, as the old cliche goes, would you want to tell us your international experiences about what is getting destroyed, what is getting conserved, what have you seen that gives you hope, and what have you seen that makes you despair?
Okay, well, let me just, I have a sort of I just wanted to segue from Margaret Atwood's remark,
ahead.
because there's anything that I take away from what I'm going to tell you, City Lights Books, small press started by the beat poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was a friend of my beatnik brother around 1960. There is a book called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene by Roy Scanlon, I think his name is, which is the most profound and thought-provocative book about the times that we are in now. And I can't recommend it more highly.
Do you want to say that name again so that everybody gets it?
Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene, maybe not all of you know, that's a new term which is the era that we are now in where humans are having a dominant effect on the life support systems, the other species that are here with us. And I just want to say that I've actually been involved for 50 years. I've got you by 10 years there. Going back to 1970. 1970 is a very important date because several things begin to happen. The parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere start to rise. This is man's hockey stick, almost vertically. They've been rising since 1750, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to 1750, for 200,000 years, they never got up to 200,000 ppms. Suddenly they shoot up. What else happens? The temperature shoots up. And if you look at, even though it's rather nippy here, we didn't quite prepare to how nippy it is here, and the temperature everywhere in the world is shooting up vertically. Last year was the hottest year globally, and I've done the research. I've been to the Mauna Loa Observatory on the big island of Hawaii, which has conducted the longest ongoing measurement of atmospheric carbon since 1959. When they started, it was 250 parts per million. Guess what it is now? 400 parts per million. Now, what else happened in 1970? Since 1970, there's a study which I reference. I recommend you go to my website, dispatchesfromthevanishingworld.com, which I started in 2001 to document the disappearance of species and ecosystems and indigenous cultures. In 1970, since then, half of the individual animals in this global meta-study population of animal populations have been killed. The actual numbers of these populations have been cut in half. Another study has 30% of the species on Earth disappearing, I think, very soon, by mid-century. I just want to tell you what I am not an authority on India. I am somebody who has been able, because this is a writers' conference, I have been able to write things that have changed policy. And if you go to my website, you'll see dispatches from the Vanishing World. The dispatch number 69 is called Agony in Ivory. That was in Vanity Fair. That started this movement, the ongoing movement that has just stopped, resulted in Hong Kong, the biggest market for ivory, banning ivory sales.
Oh, wow.
So this is really good. You can do this. The word, as Margaret Atwood said, is very powerful. You can change policy. You know, I did a thing also in 1990 about the first big piece, that was also in Vanity Fair, about the ethnocide of Tibet by the Chinese. And Papa Bush, President Bush Sr. was so moved that he invited the Dalai Lama to the White House, which nobody had dared to do. So you can do this with writing. You can look at my stuff. I'm going to explain in the long form session how I actually write you have to make people care. And then you get a crucial momentum of people who are demanding change. And if it's not a dictatorship, if it's a democracy, your representatives had better do what you're asking them to do, or you would vote in somebody else. Now, I know that it's much more complicated in India, and India has got some really horrendous problems, as you know. As the population problem is just, the population growth is it's already, basically there are too many of us on the planet, but particularly in India. And how do you stop that? I don't think you can say, okay, from now on you can only have one kid. That's not going to go over in India. But you can have female empowerment. And that's a big movement. A very, very old friend, my old Harvard roommate, Judith Bruce, started the Population Council, and she's been doing this since 1970. She was a pioneer of this. If you can persuade a woman in a village not to get married at 14, but to go to the big city, Delhi or the nearest city, and have a good time until she's 18, and then have her first kid, that makes a huge effect on population growth. And female empowerment is a huge thing. There's a lot of great things that are going on. Now, I have my friend Variel, who's just flown in from, we'll just be talking very soon about Borneo and palm oil. I hope I'm not going on too long, but I'm trying to. So, Variel is involved with the Barefoot College. Have you heard about that? That's one of the great initiatives where villages, poor villages, off the modern grid, the grandmothers get solar panels, so they can, sure, thank you. So they can, the grandmothers put together these solar panels. It gives them a sense of self-worth. It gives the village power off the grid and income as they're making more and more of these solar panels. It's one of the most brilliant initiatives that I've heard of. And you can talk to Varial here, but you want to stand up because he is here not to see me. It's purely by accident, but is here to gather support to get the word out about this initiative. Now, let me just finally, maybe I just have one more.
Two quick final.
Okay. I have a book coming out about Borneo, where I've been twice. I spent, the first time I went to see Biruti Galdikas, who has dedicated her lives to the orangutans of Borneo. And the second time, Varial and I camped with the Penan, the last nomadic Penan hunter-gatherers in Sarawak, who still hunt with blowguns. Lovely, gentle people, and their forest is being, it's up in the highlands, is being destroyed by loggers. Down in Kalimantan, I didn't know this, and I had written a piece for Vanity Fair, which I recommend you read, called A Day in the Life of a Modern Consumer, which outlines everything, every effect that we're doing since from the moment we turn on our light, our bedroom light. This laptop, all your cell phones, you realize that you are killing the gorillas and the last okapis in Congo because it has a little strip of coltan, which is this very rare metal that has a very high melting temperature. So they put these capacitors in these things. And I've been to the camps. You can read that on my website. I think it's Dispatch 2 about the guys that are, these are just artisanal miners, and the guy has an AK-47, he goes out and kills gorillas and okapis, and they eat them.
Oh.
And so that's just one thing. All right, so, okay, I have some more points, but
can we
come back to
yeah, we
them?
can come back, and then the audience will seek you out and crush you
Sorry,
with questions,
okay.
I'm sure.
Can I just respond to the question that was raised?
Very quickly.
And very briefly.
Yeah.
As Valu said, India has a very active, very vibrant, very vocal, very aggressive civil society movement. And all the great milestones in environmental decision making in India have been influenced profoundly by civil society organizations. But the problem arises is that civil society organizations are dealing with democratically elected governments. And in democracies, ultimately, my philosophy has always been that civil society must have its say, but democratically elected governments ultimately will have their way. The problem arises when civil society organizations arrogate to themselves all power and all wisdom and do not allow governments to function. And that's where you have a breakdown of law and order, and you have tensions. But the point that you make is absolutely true, and what Valu says, that in the last couple of years, the shrinking space for civil society, particularly on matters relating to environment, is a cause for great worry and is actually weakens democratic foundations.
I'd just like to say on that, Jairam, that a committee of secretaries is not a democratically elected body. And if they overturn decisions by civil society or
I think this is a complete misreading of government. Committee of secretaries is a body to which ministers delegate their powers. So you cannot say that committee of secretaries is not a democratically elected government. Committee of secretaries decisions ultimately go back to ministers, go back to cabinet, go back to democratically elected people. So I have a slightly different view on this than Valu. You know?
All right, so culpability is laid now at different doors. One very quick round, and picking up from solar. Ajay, we talk about renewable and the great white hope of solar, 100,000 megawatt. Is this real? Can it happen? Because a lot of people are thinking we're going solar and we're going to solve our energy problems, but there are issues there. Can you give us a quick feel?
Sure. day before yesterday, we opened our latest orders of solar power, and the prices tumbled even further. So now
In Rajasthan.
in Rajasthan, 4 rupees 33 paisa for a kilowatt hour of
This
electricity.
is what Sun Edison is saying.
No, this is now a Finnish company called Fortum which is providing this. Nevertheless, it's still twice as much as electricity from other sources. But I think what you need to look at is that in 5 years, the price has declined from 18 rupees a kilowatt hour to 4.35. It's going in the right direction. Having said that, is everything okay? Of course not. You need 4 megawatts of solar to provide as much electricity as 1 megawatt of coal. Remember that. That's one. Second, solar disappears at night. We need electricity at night. Where does that come from? You need some storage. You either need gas, or you need batteries, or you need pumped storage. In other words, for every megawatt of solar, you also need to invest in a megawatt or half a megawatt or a third of a megawatt of something else to provide electricity when the solar is not doing it. Are we there? No, we are not. But I think it is on the right track. The economics is on the right track. The policies, also the policies, the numbers, the interest is on the right track. If you ask me, it is a matter of time.
Okay.
So what we can discuss is whether it can happen in 5 years or whether it happen in 15 years.
Okay. Do
But-
you think 5 or 15?
I believe in the 15 number. I don't believe in the 5 number. Okay. Because of the kinds of issues that
Right.
happen. Nevertheless, this is not to say that things can't happen, and I want to come back to the point of civil society. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, what we looked at was that each one of us has lights in our homes. To provide that light, you need electricity. You're burning coal somewhere, it's producing carbon dioxide, creating all kinds of pollution. Can we get light but use less electricity, produce less pollution? Sure. Move to LEDs. LEDs cost a lot. To cut a long story short, new business model provides LEDs to everybody at 10 rupees a month. If you move to LEDs, the savings that you make are more than 10 rupees a month. So what you're paying is less than that. This civil society, we needed to get civil society involved. There is a website where you can actually see how many LEDs have been sold through this program. The number now is 50 million.
I bought a part of them.
You got them. In this state, of these 50 million, 7 million have been sold in this state. Price less than 100 rupees.
Yep.
Payable 10 rupees a month on your electricity bill. Short point, you can make things that you and I can actually do. This is easy to do. You can make things which make a difference. You can get people to ask, why is my state not doing it? Why is my city not doing it? In other words, 4 things that make environmental sense. It is possible to have business models. It is possible to have public participation. It is possible to have impact. The need is to put those things together.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful to end on a green hope. And I don't think 15 years is a very long period. So if you can see something happening, I think that we're ending with Ajay's take on this as a very positive thing with something that has been demonstrated.
But can I just say that in spite of all the optimistic picture that has been painted by Ajay Mathur, which I'm sure will materialize, India will still need.
Yep.
This is the reality of India. In spite of 100 gigawatts of solar, in spite of 60 gigawatts of wind, India will still need to increase its coal consumption at least 2.5 times
what it is now.
India will need to increase its nuclear capacity at least 5 times. This is the conundrum that India has, that we need massive amounts of solar, we need massive amounts of energy efficiency, but at the same time, given our demographic realities and our economic growth challenges, we'll need to at least double, if not triple, our coal consumption in the next 15 years, and we'll need to almost increase our nuclear capacity for 3 to 5 times.
Technology, technology, technology is where we need to head to reach some of these goals. Valmik, your last take, a green hope.
My green hope or out of the box idea is quite simple. We have a system that governs India, and I'm focused on India, so please excuse me because that's an important issue for the whole world. We have 700 districts that make up the map of India, roughly.
Somebody brought it.
And every district has a budget. So I'll give you an example. Savai Madhopur, where Ranthambore Tiger Reserve is, has roughly a budget of 800 crores a year, which is supervised by the district collector. In this money, rolling for 60 or 65 years are hundreds of schemes. Some which minimize the use of bad energy. There's a lot of alternative energy. There's a lot of solar energy. There's a budget to protect forests. There's a budget to keep things going the right way. I am suggesting as a green hope that we need to examine these budgets in terms of how we are administered and outsource a green commissioner who extricates this money and focuses only on it. Outsourced meaning he is not necessarily a government servant. We've had a lot of administrative reform suggestions about lateral inductions in this sector and in other sectors. Few listen, but in every district, if we had someone who would use already available money and focus it in the right way, it will start to make a difference on our carbon footprint. I know you may have to have a huge amount of coal consumption, but let's start at that level in the district where we have a focused approach to a strategy. Everything is there, but it gets dissipated. So one green hope is to have people looking at this issue right down there to see how we can restructure the working of district administration to make it much greener than it is.
Thank you. So participation again and diversification, I would say. Alex, your last words.
Okay, first of all,
The green hope.
I think the first thing that everybody has to do is educate themselves on what's happening. Now, right at the moment, there are these terrible peat fires that have been burning out of control in Borneo, and this is the oldest rainforest on Earth where the orangutans, many undiscovered species, are just going up in smoke. The orangutans, they're just talking with Doctor, have been suffocating from smoke inhalation. They're starving to death. If you go online, you can see these emaciated, half-dead orangutans. And who is the biggest consumer of palm oil? India. Which has replaced ghee as the main cooking oil, which is great because ghee is artery clogging. It's a complicated issue, but we don't have to have progress, bringing people into the modern consumer society and the free market capitalist democracy has a real downside. It doesn't have to. It shouldn't destroy the planet, and it will, unless people stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, we need to make this big shift to a more compassionate civilization. You may have heard that phrase, which is what I see this whole gathering is all about. However, the population of India is growing much faster than people can be brought into and given the benefits of the modern, such as they are, society. My final point is, I just stumbled on this, you can do the research on all of this. A lot of it is online. You talk to people, but think outside the box. And I'll give you an example. I was studying meditation in Kathmandu at a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, and my meditation master said, practice the giving and receiving meditation, where you breathe in the suffering of the world and then you breathe out love and to all sentient beings. So I'm doing this and I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm breathing in oxygen and I'm breathing out CO2. Don't they have this backwards? a bit. I'm contributing to the CO2 problem. And my guru said, you know, you think too much. So I did a little research. My brother is a Tibetan Buddhist. He got me into all of this. Each of us takes 25,000 breaths a day. I had no idea. That seems a lot, but that apparently is true. Multiply that by 1.25 billion people. What is the effect of that? You know, on top of all the other emissions from our fossil fuels, I don't know. So
But
if any of
Alex,
you...
your green hope cannot be that we stop breathing.
No, we can't stop breathing, but that just shows, how sort of, implicated we are, and we have to sort of unimplicate it. Wangari Maathai, good last green hope, the Nobel Prize winning founder of the Green Belt movement of Kenya. I talked to her about this, and she said, well, each of us needs to plant a tree.
Good point.
To offset our lifetime emissions.
Yeah, so we all need to plant trees if we want to continue breathing. We have some time, and I'd like to hear from the audience. The gentleman in front. Is there another mic going around this side?
Environment and ecology. I think in the corridors of power, these are keywords which are unmentionable even today, regardless of the efforts made by Jairam and his team. On the other hand, the bureaucrat will do nothing and the politician will only talk. So I'll just say the only possibility and the green hope is to get a groundswell going. It's a democracy, for God's sakes. And if the writers can get together, if the educators can get together, if we all can get together, that's the only way to work up, drum up support and make the democracy work.
Yeah.
Public participation, this side. Green hopes now. Don't tell us how bad everything is. Green hopes.
Thank you for the panel. I just have one fundamental question, actually. So we're talking about green hopes, and we're talking about, with all due respect to orangutans, but maybe it's a little bit rich coming from us when we talk about green hope, when you realize that there are 200 to 300 million Indians and several more people across the world who do not have access to basic electricity. Where does that question come in? Where does that come into the discourse of grow now, pay later? Why is that something we don't talk about enough when we talk about decreasing our own carbon footprints? But what about those people? They are a huge part of the India that we live in.
Thank you for making that point to bring perspective. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd just like to hear from the policymakers.
Can we get some questions from you guys first? Yeah. Will you pass it backward? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, I think, to Mr. Mathur, is that I don't know if I can believe what we hear in the media, but a lot of the damage has been done by the first world in terms of climate change. And we also hear that they refuse to take responsibility for the enormous amount of damage that they have done. Have they started taking responsibility, or are they still trying to dump a lot of it on the third world countries who have a lot of other problems as well?
Should we do that at the end? Some more questions? Yeah.
Hello. Should I? Can we? It will be better if we can follow the Germany model.
Germany
model of solar energy, where almost every household is having solar power on their rooftops. So once you have the solar panels on the rooftop, plus the net metering system,
right,
which motivates the consumer to earn while he is spending on the electricity, and in the net he might even save the amount. So that will go a long way in saving the natural resources.
That will certainly go some way. I don't know how long, but yeah.
My question is in similar vein to the previous two questions. So my question is to Mr. Mathur. You spoke about how Paris was a positive. So there are two ways of looking at Paris. One is when you look that the world is deteriorating and the environment is deteriorating, so Paris may be positive for the world. But the Paris Climate Summit was also about international environmental negotiations, and you were the representative of the Indian stance. So from the perspective of India, do you see it as a positive in that there's been a change where we have now binding emissions through the INDCs, previously we didn't through the CBDR process, and Sunita Narayan has raised this point about how we need to differentiate poor emissions from rich emissions. For instance, the village housewife who cooks with a chula cannot be equated with industrial pollutant. The dhobi who burns coal in his iron cannot be equated industrial. So what is your perspective on whether Paris was positive for India? Thank you.
Any other Paris question for Ajay? Then he can quickly respond to that. Any other Paris question? All right, Ajay, will you just quickly respond?
Okay, very quickly. One of the positive things about Paris was that each country put up what it can do. So the Indian INDCs said what we can do, to the point of yes, there are lifeline emissions, and there are emissions that are much more economic based and therefore are amenable to So, when Mr. Ramesh was the my minister, we had introduced a program for industry that they must become more efficient. They had a 3-year period which ended last year. The industry ended up saving 20% more than their target. Right? So yes, it is up to us. We decide as a country where is it that we would like action to occur. This goes back to the point that yes, we need to make sure that everybody has access to clean energy. There are 120 million Indians who still use biomass for cooking. See the amount of health impacts that they have. We need to ensure that they have access to cleaner cooking fuels. This biomass, zero carbon dioxide. Cleaner cooking fuels, positive carbon dioxide. But it's a transition that we need to make. Short point. At the end of the day, it is what makes people's lives better, while at the same time ensuring that the world moves to a lower carbon path. I think it is up to us as a country, and clearly public participation is important. But what I believe that the Paris agreements have done is provided the framework in which it is possible for us to do that.
Another set of questions. I think you need to answer the young lady who asked whether the common differentiator moved anywhere.
The short point is there is no mea culpa. Nevertheless, we can sit back in a corner and say, I am not going to play this game till a mea culpa comes. We will all drown together. The point is, we need to act. Even if we were not part of the problem, I would like us to be the leaders in the solution. Whether it is solar, whether it is LED bulbs, we will be the world's #1. Let's look at this as an opportunity. Because a very large number of us still don't have access to adequate energy, we have the huge opportunity to create these new business models which can go to the rest of the world.
Sure.
I look at that.
Any other questions before we conclude?
Hello, my question is regarding what Mr. Mathur said, that green hope is possible and conservation is possible by many people. But I think the greatest problem is the knowledge gap, that many people, like Mr. Thapar said, there are around 700 districts. So people don't even know that conservation is necessary and climate change is a reality. So how do you get that knowledge gap to cover up? Thank you.
Can I just take that? Because I think we go on saying that people don't know. People do know.
Yeah.
Gene Campaign has been conducting surveys in rural areas. They'll tell you how it's changing. They're also trying to cope with it. I think where the gap exists is what Valmik was saying, that there is a local response. We need to step that up.
And you need to educate much more the government officer. He doesn't know, and I have senior ones sitting here and they're all not there. I have senior police officers and senior forest officers in this audience, and they know from their colleagues that they don't know, and they are in charge of decision making. And people like Jairam and other bureaucrats who are traveling across the world need to make sure politically that this gap is dealt with. You cannot have ignorant decision makers taking decisions for the poor of this country. You have to educate them in their training courses from the right from the bottom to the top. It's not there. It's not in Missouri. You're not getting enough information on this. And for God's sake, let's clean up that act.
Amen.
Okay.
There's one question.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I just came in the session.
Short question,
And
please.
one of the things that has always intrigued me is that there is a lot of talks, and we've been talking for a long time. What's happening, what the problems are. My question to each one of you is this: how do we involve and engage those who are not present in this tent? They are the adults, the students, administrators, and service. How do we really engage and involve? There is no shortage of talking, printed matter,
Completely correct.
all about international conferences and all that thing. But they all go to waste.
I know. So
So
can we do
please,
this? Can we get our cups of tea and talk to each other about how we can do this? And Alex is dying to say something.
Involve and engage.
You're right.
Who are not in this tent.
Totally. I think you make a very valid point. Alex,
Okay, I just want to make very quickly this final point for me to give to you, is that study the things that work. All political systems are flawed, I hate to tell you, whatever they are. The American system is just as flawed as any of them that I belong to. You study things like the Green Belt movement of Wangari Maathai, the late Nobel Prize winner, which restored the environment, empowered females, and it stood up to the same kind of politics that you guys are facing. Now, I just want to leave you with a fable, an animal fable that Wangari told me, because it's about what you can do, what can I do, what we all ask ourselves. And this is a fable about a hummingbird, South American Indian fable, Amerindian fable, and the forest is on fire. All the animals have fled the fire except for the little hummingbird who is going to a spring and scooping up little slivers of water with its beak and going back to the flames and dumping these little drops of water. And the other animals say, "Oh, what do you think you're doing, foolish little bird?" And the hummingbird says, "I'm doing what I can." So we can all do that. And 100,000 hummingbirds can make a difference, believe me.
I think we just have 2 minutes. Maybe we can have a line from each one of you for a green hope.
So, Jairam, do you want to come? Do you want to come? I think we've all said our green hopes.
We've said our green hopes, but my green hope is that we are more inclusive and open and sharing decision making. We can no longer be a very closed government versus non-government grouping. We need to join hands, the best inside, the best outside, and allow for a much greater degree of decision making, less vested interest in how people are appointed and where they go. We need much more transparency here.
And participation. I think we've used this word participation right through. Those of you who are interested in climate change, I'm sorry for doing this, but there is a book that I brought out on climate change. It's there in Narayan Nivas. Nothing comes to me, it goes to a Teen Campaign, just to explain that. But anyone who's interested, it's a nice picture book on climate change, what it does, where it affects, how, and therefore if you're interested, do take a look. Thank you very much to my panelists. Thank you Ajay, thank you Jairam, thank you Valmik, and thank you Alex. I think it's been great.
And once again, thank you Alex, thank you Valmik, thank you Suman, Mr. Jairam Ramesh and Ajay Mathur. Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. This session was sponsored by Rajasthan Patrika, and we all have green hope. We all need to participate. We all need to save our environment. Thank you for being here.
भाषा नहीं, हमारा संस्कार, हमारा
We will do
इतिहास
our
है,
next
हिंदी एक
session
सोच है,
in about 10
जीवन जीने
minutes.
का तरीका।
So while we prepare for our next session, you enjoy. The authors are here. Have a little chat with them. They will be signing their books at the back. If you have the books, go to the back and get your books signed.
इंटरनेट और अन्य साधनों से लोगों की बात उठाता है, लोगों को जीता है तो उनके दिल जीत कर देखिए। हिंदी पढ़िए और हिंदी बोलिए। राजस्थान पत्रिका, देश का प्रमुख समाचार पत्र समूह। हिंदी सिर्फ एक भाषा नहीं, हमारा संस्कार, हमारा इतिहास है। हिंदी एक सोच है, जीवन जीने का तरीका है। अपनी भाषा को इज्जत देना, अपने वजूद को सम्मान देने जैसा है। हिंदुस्तान की सैकड़ों भाषाएं हिंदी में शामिल हैं, इसलिए हमेशा से सबकी पसंदीदा है। देश के सबसे बड़े हिंदी अखबारों में एक है पत्रिका। उत्तर भारत से लेकर पूर्व पश्चिम दक्षिण तक सबके दिलों में बसा। आज राजस्थान पत्रिका केवल अखबार नहीं, रेडियो, टीवी, मोबाइल, इंटरनेट और अन्य साधनों से लोगों की बात उठाता है, लोगों को जीता है तो उनके दिल जीत कर देखिए। हिंदी पढ़िए और हिंदी बोलिए। राजस्थान पत्रिका, देश का प्रमुख समाचार पत्र समूह। हिंदी सिर्फ एक भाषा नहीं, हमारा संस्कार, हमारा इतिहास है। हिंदी एक सोच है, जीवन जीने का तरीका है। अपनी भाषा को इज्जत देना, अपने वजूद को सम्मान देने जैसा है। हिंदुस्तान की सैकड़ों भाषाएं हिंदी में शामिल हैं, इसलिए हमेशा से सबकी पसंदीदा है। देश के सबसे बड़े हिंदी अखबारों में एक है पत्रिका। उत्तर भारत से लेकर पूर्व पश्चिम दक्षिण तक सबके दिलों में बसा। आज राजस्थान पत्रिका केवल अखबार नहीं, रेडियो, टीवी, मोबाइल, इंटरनेट और अन्य साधनों से लोगों की बात उठाता है, लोगों को जीता है तो उनके दिल जीत कर देखिए। हिंदी पढ़िए और हिंदी बोलिए। राजस्थान पत्रिका, देश का प्रमुख समाचार पत्र समूह।
We believe in bringing the world together through entertainment. See entertainment. Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. The world is my family.
हीरे मोती से कब तुलती हैं खुशियाँ, शोहरत दिल की कमान।
गेम्स, मूवीज और म्यूजिक के 71,21,302 मिनट, ये सब फिट होता है एक छोटी सी दुनिया में।
Free music, movies and games only on Airtel, the smartphone network.
There's this magic about India.
अभी जितनी आज़ादी मिल गई है, जितना ज़्यादा फास्ट जा रहा है इंडिया हमारा, ये कुछ बता नहीं सकते।
There is nothing in this world that you can do. You just need to get yourself out of the bed and start doing it, man.
He was asking me, is it going to rain? They don't know what's going on in the world. I'm the most educated guy in this village. I'm the only guy who can speak in English. So I have access to internet. They don't know the uses of internet. They can't imagine that internet can be used for education purpose. If you give these two tools, English language and internet, I can bet on this. It's going to change everything.
Hello guys, as you can see, this is my house and no Wi-Fi at my house. This is my neighbor come friend. No Wi-Fi in his house, but yes, Wi-Fi is there at his neighbor's house. Yeah, so me and my friend come neighbor sit here and use my neighbor's house Wi-Fi. India is a country of brotherhood. We have one Wi-Fi router, but 5 families use that Wi-Fi router.
It's 4 o'clock in the evening. I'm currently standing outside my house on my field. What technology brings to here is truly amazing. It can change people's lives. I work as a web developer from my own house, from my own bedroom, and now I have 10 Mbps fiber optic Wi-Fi. About 5 years ago, we didn't even have proper dial-up connection. It's amazing how a simple internet connection can change people's lives. I can now make amazing mobile apps from my own house.
There are so many things about India which are just amazing.
We have so much people here, and the diversity.
If you think that you are not capable of doing anything, you are wrong.
Communication, education, technology, transportation, population, politician. We are gonna make this nation. We are gonna develop this nation. I am a citizen of a very great and wise country, and I am proud of it.
Good morning, everybody. There's still time for our next session, but I'll read some house rules, and I must thank all our sponsors who have been responsible for this festival to go to such great heights. So let me first thank you, our sponsor Z, with the Rajnigandha silver poles, and it's powered by Airtel. Then we have Google, this Google Mughal tent. They are the sponsor for this tent. Ford. Then we have Hindustan Times, Aga Khan Foundation, then Dettol, Amity University, Dove, Rajasthan Tourism, British Council, the Getty Foundation, the Glenlivet, Amway, Kotak, AU Finances, Narayana Health. This one I can't read it, but I think it's John Michlewski, Coca-Cola, YPO, Kingfisher, Digi Palace, Rambagh, Meridian, Clark, State Bank of Bikaner and Jaipur, Indigo, Uber, Penguin, Rajasthan Patrika, Red FM, Dainik Bhaskar, DNA and Twitter. Welcome to the festival, and I would like to tell you that after the session is over, the writers, they have their books. You can go at the back, there's an area where you can get your books signed. The other request I would like you to note, I know it's not very cold, but you like to have your coffees and teas with you, but please help us to keep our venue clean. Thirdly, I would request if you can keep your phones on silent, and if you need to talk on your phone, if it's an urgent call, please go out of the venue and talk, because the speakers who are here, if they are speaking, they are doing the sessions and they are having the intellectual interaction with all of you, it's quite disturbing to see somebody talking on the phone while you are sitting here. So keep your phones on silent. Now some more rules, just so that, like the festival runs smoothly and there are no security goof-ups or anything. Don't leave your bags unattended. You hear this everywhere, whether you are taking a flight or you're on the train. So keep your bags with you, just in case you see something which you feel that it doesn't belong to you or to the person next to you. I'm here all the time, please bring it to my notice and I'll do the needful. If you can, right now it's not house full, but just in case the house is full and you see some old person standing, please offer your seat to them. No flash photography, because that's disturbing for the writers who are up here on the stage. We like to keep the aisles free for security considerations. And there has never been any emergency or anything, but I think we should be prepared. So in case of emergency, if there's any problem, we will be there to guide you. So just stay calm and understand the situation at that point. So now I think with that, I think we are all okay. We all know what to do and what not to do. Writers should be here any minute, so we shall be starting the session very much in time. And the other thing which I want to say, we will have the mics for question answers. We want you to ask a very short question, just the question, not your statement, just the questions, because there are many people who want to ask questions. So if you take longer on the mic giving your statement, the others won't get their chance, and sometimes they get irritated with us. So just short questions when it's question answer time. Thank you very much for being here, and we're looking forward to the next session, which I'm sure you all will enjoy. Thank you very much.
innovations in our most capable SUV, the all-new Ford Endeavour.
The humanities makes us ask the big questions. What's it all about? What's the purpose of life?
What does it mean to lose someone? What is loss about?
Nature of the human being, guilt and innocence.
It's like
So ladies, gentlemen, we are ready. Our authors are here. As you know, this festival runs like a clock. So let's welcome for the session Deep Blue, How the Mediterranean Came into Being. We have Cyprian Broodbank and Erwin Finkel on stage. Thank you very much and welcome.
Oh, thanks.
I'll just introduce. Yeah. Okay. So we start now?
Yes. Thank you. I'll be over there. So do you want to use the main mic or be my turn? Yes, that's fine. That's fine. And I can get over there with that, can I? Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very hearty welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see you here. My name is Erwin Finkel. I have the job of introducing our distinguished speaker, Cyprian Broodbank. I'd just like to say that I'm a curator in the British Museum in London, and Cyprian here used to work at University College, which is about 4 minutes walk away from my office, and I never met him before until 5 minutes ago in Jaipur.
And it's a very great pleasure.
So that, I must say, is a marvelous tribute to the pulling power of literature. Now, we're in line here for a remarkable treat, because this book, whose title goes as follows: The Making of the Middle Sea, A History of the Mediterranean from the Beginning to the Emergence of the Classical World, is a subject which no other person on the globe would even think of writing a book about, because its span and the range of subject material, the length of time and the geography involved are the most extraordinary rich challenge. And the book, a mere 750 pages, is something that everybody should read with intelligence and attention. So I'm going to give the floor to our speaker, who's going to give you a PowerPoint, an illustrated talk about this, but I would just like to say that I thought of a good title for Cyprian. I think he should be regarded as the cosmic giant piano teacher, because he operates on a vast scale and begins with Middle Sea.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an immense pleasure and honor to be here. I'd like to thank Irving, my recent acquaintance from across the road in Bloomsbury, for his more than generous introduction, and to all the organizers of this stupendous festival for the invitation and for quite spectacular hospitality. I'm going to start a long way out and focus in. We live today on a largely blue planet. Can you all hear me at the back, by the way? Is the microphone working? Excellent, thank you. I fear we may not be able to. If we can't, I'll talk you through the maps if you can't understand, if you can't see them clearly from that range. We live on a blue planet. 71% seawater by area and rising. But our histories of it until recently have been far too green and brown. Of late, that's begun to change for the last 500 to 1,000 years. Maritime or ocean history, a new thalassology, has rectified this for the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Chinese and Pacific Seas over the last half millennium or so. Now, from that point of knowledge, one could do two things. One option is to look forwards, over the cusp of the present and into the future, and this is where I find out whether this wonderful machine works. It does. To look forward to the next 10 or 20 years, for example, in the seas of south and east of China and adjacent nation states, where sea laws set out during the recent age of Western hegemony confront far deeper time and more ineffable Chinese claims. This, of course, one of the hotspots for where World War III may or will break out. One could go further into the future and think of oceans that at the moment we can hardly dream of. The great Arctic Ocean that is being opened up by global warming. The New North, as it's been, down we go, I thought something would happen. Those of you under 40 in this audience will probably have the opportunity to take a cruise to the North Pole, which, before you crack open your champagne upon arrival, I suggest you contemplate the deeper meaning for our planet of what that possibility will mean. But even today, if you look at the number of ships stopping at a port like Archangel, Anchorage, it's doubling pretty well every year. We are creating new oceans, and indeed, it's these new oceans that will diffuse attention from areas like the South China Sea. Are we likely to get any pictures back? Fantastic. I'll plow on regardless. I'm sure you can all imagine your map of the world, and soon we'll get back to rather sort of smaller and more focused areas. Because today what I'm going to do is look in the other direction, not into the future, but from the perspective of deep history. A deep history accessed through an archaeology of a data omnivorous kind. And I think there are three reasons why this kind of deep archaeological history matters. One is it gives us an awareness of the rootedness of maritime propensities in our species, among human beings, across time and space. Secondly, unrelated in a sense, it shows us the deep foundations of many of the patterns and problems that emerge into the light of more recent, traditionally defined history of recent centuries and today. And thirdly, I think it encourages us to think differently about the messages we derive from history. A history not of empire and state, of ethnic boundaries and difference. A history of networks, a connective history, a reticulate one if you like, and a more deeply tolerant history for all of us. We move on. In fact, if one thinks back into evolutionary time, oceans have been important to how we came into being from hundreds of millions of years ago. The new biogeography is producing some very interesting patterns in the evolution of monkeys. And here I had a very nice picture of all kinds of very pretty South American monkeys, but you can imagine what they might look like. We've long known two very basic things about this part of the world. Firstly, that South America and Africa used to be tectonically joined. The great bulge of Brazil fitted into the bite, if you like, of Benin and the arc of West Africa on the one hand. We knew that. And we knew that every monkey living in South America today is descended from an ancestor living in Africa. For a long time, the most parsimonious and obvious reason to explain that is when South America and Africa were sundered, the monkeys went with them and differentiated with an ocean between them. Nice and easy. Wrong. Because the genetic clocks are now producing a very, very interesting result. Crude as they are, disputed as they are, it is more or less beyond doubt that the South American and the African monkeys diverged genetically after the Atlantic began to open. They transferred across a narrow precursor of the great ocean that separates America and Africa and Eurasia today. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that monkeys develop boats. It didn't mean they meant to do it. But getting across the sea has been a very deep time pattern in our ancestors' evolutionary history. And this continues into the world of early hominins and early human dispersal. Most of the way in which we got around the planet, our ancestors got around the planet were largely terrestrial, but we see some very interesting and striking short-range exceptions. One of them, probably the most famous, comes from the island of Flores in Indonesia, where something just under 1 million years ago, Homo erectus, one of our direct ancestors, managed to get across a water gap of probably 15-20 kilometers across a line called Wallace's Line, which is one of the great biogeographical dividers between the animals of India, Asia, Southeast Asia on the one hand, and the marsupials of Australia. By 50,000 years ago, plus or minus, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, had made it to Australia itself, across a barrier of something like 60 to 100 kilometers. That's impressive. They'll have been doing that on dugout canoes, on little bits of wood. That's a long way. And of these deep time perspectives, the one that amazes me most, it gives me goose pimples, is a little tiny island in Melanesia called Manus. About 14,000 years ago, somebody got there. We know that because they dropped some black volcanic glass that could not have come from that island. The distance to the nearest land was about 270 kilometers, and the middle 90 of those were blind in terms of crossings. You couldn't see where you'd come from, you couldn't see where you're going to. Still gives me goose pimples. That's a long time ago. Now, all these opening examples, I think, are very interesting in terms of what we think of now as J-curves, the little first flicks of propensities that have taken off and skyrocketed over the last few hundred or thousand years among our species. They're propensities going back well into our evolution and our hardwiring as people. But today what I want to focus on is the last few thousand years, the few thousand years that form the world that we all together share and live in today. And I'm going to be starting by looking at the world's 3 great oceans, just before the dawn of our penultimate millennium, before about 1000 AD. And at this point, it would be really nice to have some pictures. But I don't think we're going to get them. The funny thing about this is, Irving and I were spending the last half hour working out whether this was in fact a PowerPoint presentation or not, and we decided that it most definitely was. How wrong could we be? It may yet become one. It's fine, we can paint the pictures in words. Let's start in the Pacific. 40% roughly of the ocean of the world's surface. About 2,500 years ago, people, having invented a sailing technology, an outrigger canoe technology, began to break out of Melanesia and into the outer Pacific, reaching places like Easter Island, New Zealand, and Hawaii by the early years of the Christian era. We now know, incidentally, that they also got to South America. We know that for 2 reasons. South Asian chickens that originate in this part of the world, turn up in middens in archaeological sites in Chile before Columbus. They went that way round rather than the other way round. Sweet potatoes, a South American domesticate, rocket back across the Pacific on the return voyages of these canoes. I hope you're starting to get the message. Connections across this planet are not a privilege of recent times. They're not a privilege of complicated state-level societies and empires. They're something we've been doing on a small scale, socially, but ambitiously, spatially, for thousands of years. That Pacific pattern has become fairly well established and has been fairly well known for 2 or 3 decades. The remarkable area, and I'm not just saying this because of the audience, is the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean has long presented riddles that we are archaeologically only beginning to engage with now. And when people come up to me as an archaeologist and say, why do you do this? Surely it's all been dug up by now. Well, Irving will show how it hasn't tomorrow in his talk, and I will try to present a similar argument today. One thing that we've long known that has looked very strange indeed is that if you look at a language map of Africa, you get a mosaic of African languages over the continent, and then one differently colored blob on Madagascar. The languages of Madagascar are Austronesian. They come from Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Papua. They crossed the Indian Ocean at least 1,800 years ago, and possibly earlier. We have no archaeological signature of that whatsoever, but it happened. Another goose pimple moment, for me at least. A whole global scale process that we've yet to identify. That linguistic hint was for a long time the only one we had. A few years ago, some other extraordinary evidence started to emerge, and it emerged from the humble banana. Yes, I did say banana. The banana is a native domesticate of Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands. All our bananas come from there, originally. Banana remains have started to pop up in West Africa, on the other side of the continent, more than 2,000 years ago. They, like language, crossed the Indian Ocean. We have a linguistic, archaeological, genetic, biogeographical challenge of global scale to challenge us to address over the coming years. And the funny thing is, in contrast to all this, the Atlantic is the easy one, the late one. We make great play of Atlantic civilization over in Western Europe and in America. But the Atlantic before Columbus is the empty quarter. It's the emptiest ocean in the world. We have Viking expansion across the northern edge from about 1000 AD. We have people in the Canaries, we have people in the Caribbean from the other side. We even have people on Martha's Vineyard, which amuses American audiences no end. But we have no transatlantic civilization before the Columbian moment. Well, how did this oceanic world begin? The thesis I want to propose today is the places we need to look at are the world's little inner seas, the closed-off seas mainly around the rim of Eurasia, but not exclusively. Places in the sense that we might think of as voyaging nurseries, safe places for people to learn, to cross between islands, between peninsulas, to get used to adapt to this kind of, in a sense, completely inverted way of living, living not with the land, but with the sea. I now have a map that shows those various inner seas. The Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the seas of South and East China running up to Japan and indeed beyond, and the great island world of the Caribbean. Doing that kind of comparative deep history runs into immense issues of unequal exploration, as we'll see in a minute. People need to be looking to find stuff, and people need to be looking intelligently. But there are also great challenges of actual preservation. In Southeast Asia, connecting into the Indian Ocean world, think of the great precious markers of trade in later times. Scented wood, spices, the feathers of birds of paradise, sea cucumbers. By not having the PowerPoint here, you've been saved a particularly disgusting picture of sea cucumbers. Or rather, if you like those kind of things, they're very tasty and delicious. I find it difficult to quite get there myself, but that's simply my cultural narrowness, probably. The point is, those kind of markers of luxury trade, going back probably several thousand years, are archaeologically invisible. How do you dig up a feather, a sea cucumber, a scrap of wood? If you're lucky, you might find a seed of a spice. Equally, not all these seeds are behaving evenly. An early version of this talk I gave in Hawaii a few years ago to an unexpectedly large audience of Caribbean archaeologists had me leaving town and in fact flying to the next island a few hours afterwards, because Caribbean archaeologists, New World archaeologists, love to talk about their part of the world as the Mediterranean of the New World. The conundrum that I started to realize that is indeed the case from a few generations after Columbus. The Spanish bring in all kinds of fairly unpleasant ideas about how you use islands. Slavery, cash cropping, trade. They bring those ideas nurtured in the old Mediterranean on the eastern side of the Atlantic, and they turn the Caribbean, in a sense, to a new world Mediterranean. Go back before Columbus, and the pattern is very, very different indeed. And in fact, the particular picture that offended so many people is a map of the Mediterranean and a map of the Caribbean with the islands removed surgically in the way one can now do with PowerPoint in both cases. And the point is, it's very difficult to imagine the deep history of the Mediterranean without islands. It's actually quite easy, or rather the challenge in the Caribbean is to say, would the prehistory of the Aztecs, of Florida, of the Orinoco Delta, in fact be very different if the intervening islands weren't there? And the challenge is, the answer, as far as I can see, is it may not be that different. Even in Western Eurasia, these inner seas are not all working in quite the same way. Baltic historians of the Baltic area of Northern Europe, love to talk about the Baltic as the Mediterranean of the North. And as a couple of my Mediterranean colleagues have rather acidly put it, no one returns the compliment. The Mediterranean is never known as the Baltic of the South. We do have, however, some excellent areas where rich archaeology combined with early writing can give us a very rich idea of how these inner seas came into being. One of them, which it's a great shame there isn't a slide of, can we really do nothing about these slides? They were working fine before. Is there nothing we can do? Hello? Is there nothing we can do about the... Oh my God. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, in which case, we're all in the same boat. So if you want pictures, you can't... If you want to leave this talk halfway through, you're very welcome to, but don't leave in search of better pictures elsewhere, because there are none across the entire festival. I'm reliably informed. Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Excellent. Tantalizing. Tantalizing stuff. Yes, you can all see the Mediterranean here, can't you? No, I can't either. What you really have to hope is when Irving gets you reading cuneiform tomorrow, that you have a slightly better...
You mustn't make jokes. Otherwise, I warn you, if the slides start from the beginning, you have to start all over again.
Well, this is such a well-informed audience, we can rock it through the first half without a minute. However, I am in fact going to proceed. We're now, if any of you thought perhaps you were at the wrong talk, going to focus in on one of those inner seas, one of the most richly evidenced we have, the world of the Mediterranean, where I've been conducting my research and writing for the last 20 years, and where, in a sense, a depth of tradition of archaeological and ancient historical exploration, a combination of land and sea, allow us to explore how this sea became stitched together socially, technologically, but also cognitively, as the idea of a Mediterranean from way, way back in time. Now, the very funny joke on me at this point is, at this stage, there is a slide showing the Mediterranean, but also with a long quote from Lawrence Durrell, which I can't remember verbatim, and it's up there on the screen, but it's not. It's from page 4 of Balthazar, and it goes roughly like this. The Mediterranean, I may even have it right now, it's coming back. The Mediterranean is an absurdly small sea. The length and greatness of its history make us dream it larger than it is. Great purple words from Lawrence Durrell. And I think that's about right, actually. Well, whatever. The length and greatness of its history make us dream it larger than it is. How self-evidently true. To pour some cold water on the Mediterranean's aggrandizement, it is slightly less than 1% of all the sea space on the planet. And yet how much we talk about it. What big fat books we write about it from Brodel onwards. None of them less than 700 pages as far as I can make out. 650. Let's also think about some properties of the Mediterranean. And here it would really be nice to have some pictures, but I'll try to draw them out. Firstly, it is a unique space on this planet in one demonstrable respect. It is, by most counts, the world's largest inland sea. And secondly, it's one of only 5 tiny patches of this planet that have what we call and define technically as a Mediterraneoid environment. And that's a very specific and very challenging kind of environment. It's hot and dry in the summer, it's wet and rainy in the winter. It is incredibly unpredictable. If you're farming in that environment, you have no idea how much rain you'll get next year. Too much, too little, the wrong time, the right time, on a microcosmic scale. It is risky and full of opportunity. It's a perfect nursery, if you like, for someone like Odysseus. Risk, advantage, the unknown, the wily, the clever, the flexible. Okay? There are 5 Mediterraneanoids on this planet, and these ones I can remember because if you think about where your wine comes from, go to an off-license, as we call them in England, the Mediterranean, California, Chile, southern patches of Australia, and the Cape of Good Hope. Those are the 5 Mediterraneanoids, and that, in a sense, is the 5 places where wine viticulture has taken off during the globalization of the last few centuries. Map those onto the inner seas around the world, and you get one, and precisely one major overlap. And that is our Mediterranean. It is a very special and strange place. There is one tiny, tiny second area of overlap. And if any of you get this, I'll be deeply impressed. Any guesses? Los Angeles, Southern California, and particularly the Channel Islands and the maritime seaways between them, but on a tiny, tiny scale. Secondly, the Mediterranean, this is very funny, at this point I have a note saying properties various. Here you see the various properties nicely illustrated on the screen. That would have been my prompt. Various properties, particularly the sheer length of coastline. If you unravel the length of the Mediterranean's coast, that interface between the world of the land and the world of the sea, it is 46,000 kilometers long. Rather like unraveling the intestine of a blue whale. It goes on and on and on. It would take you most of the way around Africa, that length. And that means that you have a very crenellated coast, a coast where amphibious behavior, if you like, comes naturally and is suggested from a very early stage. We have prodigious data. It's not simply the fact that we've been digging for a very long time, partly because of the great classical tradition that emerges later there, but also we have different kinds of data. We have some of the earliest writing anywhere in the world. We're lucky to be on the edge, the periphery of Mesopotamia and of Egypt, which from 3.5 to 3,200 BC start to produce a continuous written tradition that starts to talk about the edges of the Mediterranean world from a very early stage. We have a fantastic, in a sense, world of imagery, as you can see. And we also, because of the extremes, the violent extremes of climate, have extraordinary archaeological preservation through heat and cold, dryness and extreme wetness. We have the oldest shipwrecks in the world on the one hand. We have the papyri of Egypt on the other. We have volcanic Pompeiis and prehistoric Pompeiis through fire. From ice in the Alps, we have the Iceman. I don't know if the Iceman is well known here. He's what I think of as a high-altitude shipwreck. He's a very unfortunate chap who, 5,200 years ago, went for a walk for unknown purposes. There are many theories, some of them deeply prurient, some of them more prosaic. He went for a walk high in the Alps and never came back. And ironically, as a result of global warming, he was spewed out of a glacier about 15 years ago, intact with his entire kit. He's actually about 200 meters on the wrong side of the watershed to be a Mediterranean man. But science is pretty good now, and archaeology is even better. We can tell from the pollen in his clothing that he had walked up from the valleys of northern Italy. He was a Mediterranean man, deeply lost in the mountains. So extraordinary wealth, vignettes that we capture through a variety of ways. From now onwards, what I want to do is, in a sense, show you how with a rich archaeology like this, we can make sense of the deep history of how we went to sea in one part of the world, in the Mediterranean. Before we begin, we can think in a sense of a series of phases as things get more and more ambitious and complicated and connected. But before that, let's start with what I like to think of as phase 0. The long 2 million years during which people have lived around the shores of the Mediterranean, at least in Africa, and from about 1 million years ago, slightly more, in Europe and the Levant, probably earlier in the Levant. For much of this period, the Mediterranean appears to have been more a divider of people than a uniter. If you look at the patterns by which our ancestors got around that sea, they went round rather than across it most of the time, probably not all of the time. And one of the great indicators of this is that wonderful close other of ours, the Neanderthals. When I was first invited to come here, William Dalrymple was very keen that I talk entirely about Neanderthals, and I've been sending desperate emails saying, I don't know much about Neanderthals. There are people who can tell you a lot more about Neanderthals than I can. What I know is everything in my book, and that's about 5 pages. Are the cameras on, by the way? I probably shouldn't have said that. But anyway, Neanderthals are actually extremely interesting. As many of you will know, they're a species of human, extremely like us. In fact, all of us who are Eurasians have between 2 and 5% of Neanderthal DNA in us. Neanderthals emerge about 400,000 years ago out of a common ancestor that lived north and south of the Mediterranean, in Africa and in Europe, a species called Homo heidelbergensis. He didn't go to Heidelberg, nor did she. The names are strange, as we'll come to. The Mediterranean divided between them led, in a sense, to the emergence over time of 2 species through lack of contact. The Neanderthals in Europe, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, in Africa. The Neanderthals are very interesting. They lived for longer in the Mediterranean than in any part of their distribution. It's a fluke, in fact, that the first Neanderthal skull was not found in the Neander Valley of southern Germany in 1856, as is commonly believed. It was found in Gibraltar in 1848. A few years earlier, 1848, as some of you may know, was a year of political and social revolution in Europe, rather than one in human evolution. They were put in the bottom drawer and forgotten about, until it was too late to name the species Homo gibraltarensis, which is what they really should be called. Neanderthals, the last ones went extinct in southern Spain, probably in contact with our own species, or just before our own species moved into that part of the world. The Neanderthal story is a deeply and intimately Mediterranean one. But so far, not much seagoing, not much seafaring here. When did people start to go to sea? How do we know? This is... We're going to move forward to about 13,000 years ago. One of the nice things about doing archaeology is you get to throw away big figures like that. We've zoomed forward several tens of thousands of years, 13,000 years ago. The Ice Age is almost about to end, the last Ice Age. Writing won't be invented, even in his part of the world, for another 9,500 years roughly. How do we know people are going to sea? We know because we find things on islands that were definitely islands even then, that could not have got there in any other way. And there are 2 particularly beautiful examples. We find shards of a sharp black volcanic glass. It's a material, a kind of super flint, that we call obsidian. We find this. Most of the outcrops they all come from volcanoes. Most of those volcanoes are on islands, they're island volcanoes. We find them on the mainland of Greece. The only way they can have got there is by human transport. Obsidian actually is a lethal stuff. If any of you end up handling it, do be careful. It was used as a razor, even once they'd invented the Bronze Age, because it's sharper than bronze. I once had the experimental job of shaving one of my graduate students with an obsidian razor. It was extremely sharp, such that his face looked extremely unpleasant. Aha! There I am, and there is a slide from long, long ago. Yes, you can there's Gerald. Oh, did I get it right? Yeah, I think I did. There's some Neanderthals, there's some Phoenicians, The Mediterranean is unusual, the Mediterranean. The Iceman at the top, not looking very well, coming out of the ice after 5,200 years. The Mediterranean is very interesting, it's still even more interesting. Some Neanderthals. And here we are. The red dot up there shows the earliest discovery of obsidian from one of these Cycladic islands, the island of Milos, the same island that later produced the Venus de Milo. And the other dot off the western end of Cyprus is another discovery of human beings arriving on Cyprus and doing something very unfortunate indeed, we think. Because at the same time that the human beings arrive, these rather cute pygmy hippopotami and indeed pygmy elephants, very cute idea. I love your elephants, but these elephants would be about that tall. They are actually dwarf descendants of the Indian elephant, whose range at that stage extended to Syria and the coast of the Mediterranean. They were being hunted there by Egyptian pharaohs and the Syrian kings many thousands of years later. Some of these actually swam to the island of Cyprus a very, very long time ago, and because the island is small and there were no predators, they became dwarfed, rather as the dodo lost its power of flight. Anyway, these poor species, lost to the world now, vanish at around the time that people arrive. That would have involved 65, 70 kilometers of crossing of open water to get to Cyprus. It involved island hopping for several weeks down the Cycladic islands to pick up and to find this stuff, this black volcanic glass, and get back to the Greek mainland. Why did people do this? Well, the timing is very interesting, and due to the improvements in radiocarbon dating, we can now tell exactly how these first endeavors at open sea travel in the Mediterranean match with what global climate is doing. Look at the bottom plot. It's not very easy to read, but can you see some wild zigzags and a red circle? Yes? That's all you need. The wild zigzags should make you very, very scared. They are global climate from 18,000 years ago until the present. Up is warm, down is cold. You start off with a lot of zigzaggy cold, yeah? That's the last ice age. It then gets very rapidly very warm. Yeah? Can you see that? That should be the beginning of our own Holocene age. In a way, it kind of is. We call it the Burling-Alarod interglacial, because we like to call it things like that. But it's the beginning of what should be our own age. As you can then see, something goes horribly wrong, it becomes very cold again, and then it gets warm again to the right of the circle. And that enormously fast increase is the beginning of our own Holocene age. What we fondly give a separate age in climate history, the Holocene, now to be succeeded by the Anthropocene, as many people would argue. You should be frightened about two things on that map. Firstly, both the increases are increases of between 3 and 5 degrees of temperature within 50 years. I don't really care if there are climate change deniers out there now. That happened twice with us, our ancestors, trying to cope with it. What's even more scary is why it goes wrong the first time. Because what happens is as the ice melts, the great ice caps over Western Eurasia and over North America, as the ice melts, it creates an enormous lake of cold water over much of Canada and northernmost America, the tiny fragments of which are the Great Lakes that survive today. That great icy lake piles up. There's a great dam of rubble separating it from rushing down the St. Lawrence Seaway. The dam breaks around 13,000 years ago. The ice water rushes down the St. Lawrence. It hits the Gulf Stream. It closes down the Gulf Stream for 1,000 years. Gulf Stream looking a little bit wobbly today. It got closed down then. It sent the whole of northern Eurasia straight back into the Ice Age again. World population then, roughly 4 or 5 million. Less than Jaipur today. Okay? Trouble. That's why archaeology is interesting. It is highly relevant to understanding the kind of predicaments we're in. But what I find interesting with today's topic is actually people start to go to sea ambitiously in the Mediterranean, not in halcyon days with easy waters, but in very dangerous, darkly different times. This is an adaptive strategy. It's a strategy of finding new places to live as the world around you changes. That short-range propensity to cross between the islands and the straits of the Mediterranean regularly is, in a sense, broadcast during the great emergence of farming in the Near East, and it spread right the way across, starting about 9000 BC in the eastern Mediterranean, 8,200 on Cyprus, 5,500 in Spain. One of the great agricultural expansions, and the eastward lobe of that, of course, is the lobe that brings wheat and barley and sheep and goat to this part of the world. So it's a great booming outwards from the Fertile Crescent over several thousand years. What I find interesting about that map is that you can see that it's not a circum-Mediterranean process, it's a trans-Mediterranean process. It's going right the way through the heart of the peninsulas and islands. It's as if you've turned a coat inside out. Previously, the water was the blank bit in the middle, and you worked your way around the edges. Now, the water is beginning to become the communicative artery, okay? And the rim becomes the periphery. And that is where we've been, in a sense, ever since. The next inflection we see is about 5,000 years ago, 5.5, maybe 1,000 years ago, much the time that these geezers in Mesopotamia are starting to stick these little bits of wood into clay and starting to write. We see a series of things going on. We see people going to very remote and very obscure islands. We see people drawing boats for the first time. And remember, people don't draw boats to help us. They draw boats because boats are significant to them. 5 minutes, whoa, that's what comes from having to describe your maps as you go along. Let's fast forward a little bit. A new, much more self-conscious idea of seafaring. Seafaring as glory, as ideology, as challenge. In a sense, the birth of the world of Odysseus. You'll skip that one. The sail, a great shrinker of distance, and the only way in which you can actually break through the barriers of human muscle power to move huge quantities of stuff around. Probably emerging in Egypt, in the Nile Delta, just before 3000 BC. If I had a little more time, I'd tell some very funny stories about that. The one on the left is a slightly embarrassing story for the British Museum, so I'll pass gracefully on and get us onto these marvellous illustrations from 1,500 splendid of great bifid mast sailing ships coming into anchor, and on the bottom a half-sized reproduction of an Egyptian Bronze Age boat. A friend of mine was involved in this and sent me an email about it February a few years ago, and the email was entitled "What I Got to on My Summer Holidays." And I kind of thought, oh, well, it'll be the usual kind of sordid pictures of people on the beach partying. And I clicked it, and it makes your heart sing. It's basically a reconstruction of one of Hatshepsut Pharaoh's boats, sailing, in fact, in this case, down the Red Sea. These ships expand across the Mediterranean, shrinking space and bringing the world together as never before. On the bottom there, the world's earliest shipwreck, 1330 BC off the southern coast of Turkey, 10 tons of copper, a ton of tin, a myriad other imports from all over the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. We'll pass on that because you can't see a thing. What one can start to do with archaeology is to use the evidence we have to bring together, to map over time. Top left, before 6000 BC. Top right, 6000 to 300 BC. 3000 to 200, bottom left. Up to 1300 BC, bottom right. The yellow dot and the Black Sea has nothing to do with me. Phoenicians, the people who in traditional history stitched the Mediterranean together, are in fact not a cause, but a consequence of thousands of years of knowledge, experience of seafaring around the Mediterranean world. I'm going to end with 3 very different slides, however. You can use traditional archaeology to understand how the Mediterranean came into being. You can also use Musculus domesticus, the common house mouse. It's a marvelous cipher. The house mouse evolved coevally with domestication and with us settling down into villages. They're like sparrows, they need to live with us. If you plot over time the emergence of the house mouse and its spread, it is a cipher for growing connections and contacts across the Mediterranean. One of my favorite house mice is, if I can find the PowerPoint, middle map on the right-hand dot. That house mouse was the mouse unfortunate enough to get onto the world's earliest shipwreck just before it sunk. Extraordinary. From the micromorphology of the mandible of the mouse, that's a good phrase to say, the micromorphology of the mandible of the mouse, said it again, you can show that particular house mouse was of the subspecies that only existed in northern Syria. And so that boat had a few days earlier been in one of the great ports, Ugarit, in all likelihood, one of the great literate writing ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, had hopped on and has now become the most famous mouse in prehistory. To get back to one of my opening proposals, however, a more tolerant, networked, and open kind of history. This is the kind of history that Mediterranean archaeology teaches us, not the kind of grid of ethnic, timeless determinants that are locked onto this. A history of meetings, connections, fluidity, and flux. And I want to end up with this magnificent work of art, in fact, by a Japanese artist, Yukinori Yanagi. It's an extraordinary creation. It's a sand painting of the flags of the Pacific nations, intra-Pacific, circum-Pacific, and imperial, painted entirely in colored sand between two sheets of perspex. That alone, over about 5 meters by 4 meters, is quite an achievement. But then what does he do? And this is a metaphor. He introduces colonies of living ants. The ants burrow into the sand painting. The colors blur, the outlines melt. New constellations, new colors, new flags. That, for me, is ocean and maritime history in the making. That, in a sense, is a message from the deep past for our planet today. That is a message where, whether in Southeast Asia, in the Bay of Bengal, or in the Mediterranean, we encounter these tragic events. We've been there. We've all been there for thousands of years. This is a connected planet. Thank you. Thank you. What time are we?
We have about 7-8 minutes for question answer.
Sure.
So shall we go around with the mic? Will you take some questions?
I'd be delighted and honored to. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, it was interesting to me that...
I'm looking for you, I'm so sorry. Yes.
It was interesting to me that until you brought up the Egyptian sail, you hadn't talked much about navigation and techniques of seafaring, and you were describing the movement of people around oceans and seas as almost like it was a force of nature. I was wondering if that emphasis was deliberate.
No, it's not actually, and in fact, that's a very, very good question indeed, thank you. I think there's a great distinction here between the origins of seagoing, which are almost entirely in areas where the distances are small, you navigate by sea marks, by, in a sense, accumulated mental maps of knowledge of what the next landmark or sea mark is, rather than by celestial navigation of the type that you need in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and such like. It's only we were talking about this actually a few minutes before I came on. Most of the Mediterranean is actually intervisible. If you map the little areas where you can't see land, they're quite restricted. So initially, it's all about knowledge and understanding, and the challenges are quite different. In oceanic navigation, entirely different. But there's some very, very interesting indications that from an early stage, this is a profoundly cultural process rather than simply people being blown around by nature. And the most beautiful example of that I know is the Pacific, where if you think about it, the expansion out of Melanesia, out of the islands north of Papua New Guinea, right out to Easter Island and to the New World, runs from west to east. And that is in the teeth of the prevailing winds that go the other way. And that, incidentally, for any of you who are of the Thor Heyerdahl generation, is why he thought the whole thing went the other way, that they came from South America, which they didn't. We now know that. I won't go into why, but we know they didn't. But actually, if you think about it, the reason is very sensible. Why would you actually head out directly into the wind if you're exploring a great ocean for other islands, rather than with it? You want to get home. You're not suicidal. You work against the wind until people say we've got 3 chickens and 2 days water left. Then you flip round and you can get back. And of course that is also how the knowledge network of where to look and where not to look is so successfully built up. So people are very intelligent about this, they're thinking about it. No, this is a cultural creation. Not with the monkeys, probably not with hominins, but certainly as soon as we're the actors, this is culture. And that is what excites me about the Indian Ocean, because as far as we can make out, those crossings of the Indian Ocean are not circum. They're not going around the edge. They're crossing straight across the middle, very early. And as you all know better than I, there are fewer islands in the Indian Ocean than in the Pacific. That's really quite an extraordinary thing. Please.
Hello. Yeah, here.
Sorry, I think
Yeah, good afternoon. How do you just feel that working on this researching topic of Mediterranean? It's a very interesting topic. So how you came on thinking on this, working on this topic?
How did I begin?
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, because usually one has a pat answer that sounds as if one was born with this as a kind of intellectual dummy from the cradle. I began working on the archaeology of Mycenae, of Crete, of the Aegean. It's part of the kind of romantic inheritance of many of us as children. You read the Iliad, you read the Odyssey, you read the great stories of Schliemann, you become excited by it. As a child, I decided at the age of 18 I wanted to work in that part of the world. I worked for 20 years in the Greek islands. That began to make me think if you want to understand islands, you need to look comparatively. I started reading about Pacific islands, about Caribbean islands, Northern Atlantic islands. But at a certain point, and I think this is, in a sense, a crux point many of us come to, I started to realize that the frameworks of explanation I had within my world of the Aegean were not actually sufficient, that I needed to step back, partly because there were broader common denominators, and secondly, because I felt, and this is something that started to hit particularly with the great crisis of 2007-2008, that we needed as archaeologists to actually tell bigger stories. The public out there was hungry for understanding how this planet was shaped, why it got into the predicament and the pattern it did. If we don't do it as archaeologists, others will do it for us. So I started to realize that big, deep history was important. And it mattered. My next project is going to be basically trying to take the Mediterranean example and look globally at how this pattern does in fact come into being.
Hello.
Yes.
I work on Indian Ocean, and I was intrigued by your reference to people from Southeast Asia going to Madagascar. Madagascar has a current from the African side which is against the hypothesis that a marsupial was crossing the two continents, the island and the... So would you like to elaborate anything on that? And the distances which were covered in those times.
All one can say is we have a great challenge because, as you know, the archaeology of the zoology of Madagascar and the botany of Madagascar is extremely unusual as well. In fact, people used to think that it was a kind of island fragment of the great southern continent we call Gondwana land, which was the great fragmented continent used to include Australia, New Zealand, New Caledonia, much of South America. That's not now so obvious. All I can say is the archaeology of Madagascar is well known from the arrival of the Arab traders. We can start to push it back a few centuries, almost to 0 BC. It's been very difficult to go back further, but we have this language pattern, and there's really no other way of explaining it. So what we have to understand, in a sense, a two-way process. We have a short-range set of interactions with the African continent, but we also have something transoceanic going on as well. And we do not understand, I think, the temporalities of that yet. And that's the kind of thing that makes me feel young and optimistic as an archaeologist. We have heroic challenges ahead of us. I think the genetics are going to be very, very interesting too, incidentally, when we get good ancient DNA on this problem. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff to look at. I think there's another question.
Can we have a microphone here, please?
I think that will be the last question, and then we'll have to end the session.
Or you could come up to the front, and then I could hear you, and then I can give my answer through the microphone. I can then project the question to the audience. And,
very privileged to be the last question. I was actually wanting to know your opinion about something, and it got me thinking when I saw that the sand map, the sand flags, that sand painting, and the current refugee crisis that's happening based in the Mediterranean. Do you think that geopolitics has created boundaries in seafaring, especially in the current political environment? And if we go back to the metaphor, the ants are being stopped from traveling from one flag to the other and creating new entities. What would be your take on that?
That's a really, really good question. Excellent question. No, I think, and not just in the Mediterranean either. Yes, is the short answer, and I think regrettably, and I think what worries me deeply over the last few years is the creation, in a sense, I mean, the nation state is a young enough concept anyway. It's not a useful concept to think with over deeper time. It's an entirely unhelpful concept to think with through much of the archaeology I work with. It's particularly young in this form in the Mediterranean world. And I think what worries me is on top of that, we've created in the European Union something that was meant to be open and accepting and bringing people together, but in fact what it's creating is a larger, harder edge. And it's fascinating. I have colleagues, anthropologists and friends who work, for example, on the anthropology of fishing communities in southern Sicily and in North Africa, opposite. And they have a completely different understanding, a certain distance and antipathy to their capitals, their nation-state capitals, back in the north and south, but a much more common understanding across them. And this kind of ancient Mediterranean flux is being artificially sundered and blocked by some very ignorant polemics over the last few years. So I find that very worrying, and I'm not as expert in what's going on around the Bay of Bengal and then across into mainland and island Southeast Asia, but I would expect again young nation states, in a sense, creating edges where forms of maritime contact that go back as far as we can look are precipitating out in what we call a refugee crisis. Does that answer your question?
Okay, Cipriano, I think at this moment I must regretfully draw things to a close. I'd just like to say that I consider the delivery of a lecture of that range a tour de force, and to do it without the lecturer's guide most of the time is a grand tour de force. So I'd just like everybody to thank you.
Thank you.
Bravo. Bravo.
I give them a big hand to Cyprian and Irving. It has been lovely, even without the PowerPoint presentation. Sorry for this technical glitch, but to our consolation, it was all over the venues. So thank you so very much for being here, and it was very, very informative. Thank you so much.
So what happened across? Yes. What happened to the venue? Did the whole venue?
It was just some technical glitch at the power point, but it's all
Never mind.
sorted.
All done.
Thank you so much.
The Jaipur Literature Festival is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts nearly 270,000 visitors a year. Since its inception in 2008, JLF has gone international with festivals along the banks of the London Thames and across the pond in Boulder, Colorado. Jaipur Bookmark is an international B2B event for the publishing industry. It runs parallel with the Z Jaipur Literature Festival. Teamwork also promotes the best in Indian theatre through the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards, the only national platform that celebrates all the aspects of the craft from across India. The Going Solo International Theatre Festival is the first of its kind in India, bringing together award-winning single-actor performances from across the globe. While international touring productions such as Bollywood Extravaganza and Bollywood Love Story, a musical, have sold out shows across Europe, Egypt and Russia. Sounds of Freedom, the name says it all. A musical celebration of freedom of expression through workshops and outreach programs, Sounds of Freedom culminates in a live concert broadcast on television and online. The sacred celebrates the spiritual through music, movement and poetry. Teamwork Arts also produces numerous international festivals. These festivals showcase the best that Indian arts and culture has to offer. Teamwork's major nationwide festival is Delhi Live, a weekend carnival in the nation's capital. Teamwork Arts and Capital Jazz present the Jazz Utsav. This is the definitive jazz festival featuring the best of talent from India and abroad. For the young and the young at heart, the Ishara International Puppet Theatre Festival brings local and international performances to audiences across several Indian cities. While the Multi-City Kahani Festival features interactive storytelling sessions and workshops championing the power of imagination. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit www.teamworkarts.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Jap
राह गलिया डगर गाँव नगरिया शहर राह गलिया डगर, गाँव नगरिया शहर, आसमां छूले चला है इंडिया, आसमां छूले चला है इंडिया। दिन हो या शाम या सहर, स्वच्छता है एक लहर। दिन हो या शाम या सहर, स्वच्छता है